So how you respond, and that, if you I have we can use the two words react, respond. The way I use them is react means it's a karmically determined reaction. You react out of the conditioning of your mental emotional field. Response implies that you are present and your action is no longer determined by the mental emotional conditioning of the person. There is a higher intelligence, one could say, or I call it wisdom, but in other words, there's a higher intelligence that can then operate in your daily life. A higher intelligence, which we could call wisdom. So it's not the conventional intelligence that you can measure in IQ tests. That's a very limited version of intelligence. There's a higher intelligence that comes in through presence, that deals more intelligently with any situation that arises in your life. That's the only possible way of dealing intelligently, is by dealing with the situation through presence. Especially important, of course, in human relationships, because there's so much unconsciousness that happens in the interaction between human beings, between two human beings, and larger numbers of human beings, and then groups of collectives of millions of human beings here, and another million there and there. Or you can see when you look at politics and affairs and so what's happening in the world, there's very little intelligence, the way they deal with things. And you're amazed. How can they be so short-sighted and ultimately have to use a simple word, stupid? But these people have degrees, they have university degrees. How can they be so stupid? Well, they only activated a very, very limited version of intelligence that you can measure in IQ tests. That's not enough. I'm sorry, I don't want to offend anybody who has a very high IQ. Or is a member of this, there's an organization called Mensa, I believe. So if you have a very IQ, you can be a member of that, and that's good for your identity, of course. So I don't want to take anything away from you, but that is not real intelligence. It's a form of intelligence, but it's a relatively low form of intelligence. A much higher intelligence comes in through presence, and that is lacking in the world. There are occasionally you see, very rarely you see a politician, actually you can see, oh, this person has some real intelligence and insights, and it's usually not the people who are running things. If it's a politician, it's usually somebody who's been pushed to the periphery of politics, and from there he used to see comments on the stupidity of what's happening in the world. I've observed it's in different countries, a similar phenomenon. There are a few people here and there who can see clearly where we are going and what we're doing. It's crazy. Because there is a lack of this higher intelligence that is beyond the egoic mind. And, well, at the moment it doesn't look good, because we're going on. I was going to use that weird expression about the hand basket again. So you can see it, Now it's important when you look at the state of the world, it's important that you do not enter a reactive mode, because that will draw you into unconsciousness. If you watch too much television or current affairs, you will be drawn into most likely unconsciousness, unless you watch it as an anthropological study of how misguided humanity can be. So you need to stay present while you look at all this and see what's happening. Question may arise, shouldn't I be doing something to, well, there may be something you can do, bring some sanity into this world, perhaps through saying something, speaking out, pointing out something, not creating enemies. If you see people are deluded in what they say or do, don't make them into enemies and attack them and say, you are totally crazy. No, it may be that what they do maybe and probably is dysfunctional and stupid, or the opinions they hold may be extremely misguided and irrational. So you can address the opinions that they hold, their mental positions, and point out the irrationality and so on, without making the people who hold their opinion into enemies. So don't equate the mental positions that people hold with who they essentially are. You can speak out, maybe you can post something on one of the many platforms that are available, something that is sane rather than insane. But perhaps you can post something that points out the insanity of it all. Some people do that, so that's a good thing. Now, because some people may suddenly see, oh yes, that's true. So higher intelligence comes in, and that can then deal with situations, and that's the end of karma. What humanity is doing now collectively is karma playing itself out, the movement of unconsciousness. And so, as we mentioned yesterday with reference to individuals, you remember we talked about responsibility. Can you hold a person responsible for what they do if they are unconscious? We talked about that yesterday. If they are in the grip of their mental emotional conditioning, that's their karma. Can you hold a karmic formation person? Can you hold a karmic formation responsible for what they do? Not really. So there's a deep wisdom in what Jesus said, forgive them for they know not what they do. Forgiveness means the realization that they are not responsible, they cannot do otherwise. But we also, and this also applies to the collective, what all the politicians are doing and so on. They don't know any better. They are in the grip of egoic reactivity and short-sightedness that comes with it, and so on. But as is the case with individuals, although they may not be and cannot be held responsible, and yet they have to suffer the consequences of their unconsciousness. This is how humans ultimately awaken. They are not responsible, but they they create suffering for themselves and others, and through the suffering that's created through by the unconsciousness, an awakening happens. So, in other words, the ego is necessary for the awakening to happen. The ego ultimately self-destructs. It has built into it a self-destruct function. That is ultimate wisdom. So that also applies to the collective. Already, if you look at the 20th century, the wars that happened and the internal conflicts in countries that happened, the countless millions upon millions killed by other humans, what they did, the terrible suffering. This is all the movement of unconsciousness. They don't know what they do, and then humanity suffers and suffers and suffers. Through the suffering, gradually, an awakening happens. So the ego's dysfunction creates suffering, and ultimately the suffering acts as an awakener. It's just a question of how much longer is the suffering going to go, and what's the next stage, you may ask, on the scale of collective suffering. I don't know, but it doesn't look good at the moment. But you are here to represent, to embody the higher intelligence. I mean, hopefully you don't make that into a mental concept. I embody the higher intelligence. It is true, but it should not become a mental concept that you identify with. And so the sanity, you embody the sanity in a world that is still predominantly, one has to say, insane in many ways. Not all of it is insane, but a lot of it, some important parts are insane. So let's then see whatever comes is may be bad from a lower perspective, doesn't look good, but ultimately everything that happens is in the service of the evolution of consciousness, even in your own life. And if it applies in your own life, it also applies to the collective of humanity.